Thanks very much, Chris. You left the long intro you had of all my virtues here on the podium. I just noticed the things you left out, which were much more attractive than the ones that you actually read. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Barton and Leneen Ford, former Governor of the great state of Queensland and Chancellor of Griffith University, which has educated my two elder children, and I put you all on public warning that the youngest one, Marcus, starts there next year. And just be prepared. Well, my name is still Kevin. I'm still from Queensland, and depending on your perspective, I'm still here to help. It's interesting you referred, Chris, to my recent career evolutions. After my second last career adjustment in June of 2010, I went soon after on a visit to Beijing, and it was quite an interesting visit, as I went to open an exhibition at what was called the Red Lantern Gallery, which is run by a bunch of Australians on a corner of the old, what remains of the old walls of the Ming city of Beijing. And as I arrived there, all these folk from Central Chinese Television, Beijing Television, arrived with cameras in tow, like the ones up the back here, panting journalists all stumbling over one another again. The first question to me was in Chinese, which translates as this: Kevin, you're alive. Kind of puts things into perspective, doesn't it? Also, it's an interesting reflection on domestic Chinese politics. But I digress. My response to the interview question was, well, look, it's a bit like this. I began as the son of beef and dairy farmers in rural Queensland, which is a province of Australia. And I then went to university in Canberra. I studied Chinese. I then entered the Australian Foreign Service. And after that, I entered the embassy in Beijing, having been first secretary of the embassy in Beijing. I worked on the China desk of the Department of Foreign Affairs. I was then went to work in my home state of Queensland as private secretary to the then leader of the opposition, Wayne Goss. I was then his chief of staff in government. I became director general of the cabinet office in the Queensland state government. I was elected then to the House of Representatives. I was then elected to become leader of the opposition. And I was then elected Prime Minister of Australia. And based on my current career trajectory, I'm heading for a career back on the China desk of the Australian Department of Affairs. Which brings me to the duality, I suppose, of what I've sought to do in public life in the period that I have been there, which is I have a passion for the world, I have a passion for our region, I have a passion for Australia, and I have a passion for my home state, this the People's Republic of Queensland. This is a good place to live, it's a good place to be, and for us it will always be home. And going to differing expectations in the room today about what I was going to talk about, let me foreshadow at the outset that I will spend a little time tracing what is happening currently in China before bringing it right back home here to Australia and to some immediate challenges on our state political agenda, including the future of the Queensland health system. There you have a large spread, and I hope in terms of the various interests which are brought to these tables today, there is something in what I say for all concerned. Then in question time, you can ask any question, and if it's too hard, Chris O'Brien will give the answer. China. When I was a kid at university, this was a national abstraction. That is, interesting place, run by the Communist Party, middle of the Cultural Revolution, lots of red guards waving around little red books, and frankly, which had caused Australians to be fearful for the previous 20 or 30 years. By the time I'd finished university, the Cultural Revolution was over, Deng Xiaoping was back in harness, an economic reform and modernisation program had begun, and incrementally communist ideology was being thrown out the back door at a pace of knots. Roll the clock on 30 years from then, the China of today is not just a vast transformation from the China that existed when I went to university first, and a vast transformation from the China that existed as when I graduated from university. Also a vast transformation from the Beijing and China I worked in 25 years ago. But now the China of today is frankly a different planet to the China of decades past. Essentially, China, once led by the Communist Party, was a Marxist-Leninist party. Now it is led by the Communist Party, which is no longer a Marxist party, but a Leninist party still, maintaining political control of the state. But on the economic transformation front, these transformations have been fundamental, far-reaching, and now of global significance. The core point for us all to bear in mind, whatever field of work we are in, is that through to the mid-century point of this, the 21st century, China will be relevant to whatever you do, whatever field you're in. If you're from academia, if you're from the media, if you're from business, if you're in politics, regional, local, or national. China, given the extent of its global reach now, will impact on all of us. One simple statistic is this. When China becomes the world's largest economy sometime in the course of the next decade, it will be the first time since George III was on the throne that a non-English speaking, non-Western, non-democratic state will be the world's largest economy. It's worth thinking about that. So many of the norms that we assume which underpin global commerce, international relations in general, have been shaped by the Anglosphere in the period since the conclusion of the Napoleonic Wars through to the present. And the post-war order, what we now have, anchored in the UN Charter and anchored in the agreements reached in 1945, were the product essentially of the two major victors, the United States and the United Kingdom. The modern world was very much, and its order was shaped by the arrangements reached at that time. And now we have a big new player coming to the table. And so the trajectory for the future is in many respects uncertain. On the upside, it is this. China, with its formidable global economic reach, therefore represents the largest slice of growth in the global economy of any other national economy anywhere in the world. The fact that we in Australia and we in Queensland have prospered relatively in recent years owes to the fact, in large part, that China and its economic juggernaut continues to roll forward. China has enormous demand for energy, it has enormous demand for raw materials, it has enormous demand for many other things as well, goods and services. And if you look across the global economic landscape, with sustained recession in Europe, with a faltering recovery in the United States, and patchy growth in many other regions of the world, China has been the driving force, keeping, frankly, the global economy in large part afloat since the global financial crisis hit those various years ago. So on the upside, for the world's economy, it is a huge benefit. Further on the upside is this. If you look carefully at the trajectory of China's domestic economic reform program for the period ahead, this represents a whole new set of economic opportunities for Australian businesses, companies and institutions. Essentially, it's like this. For the first 30 years of China's economic reform and modernisation, the economic model laid down by Deng Xiaoping was simple and to the point. It said simply this. We need to ensure that we have market-based reforms in agriculture so that the Chinese people can more comfortably and profitably sustain themselves. And then in industry, because of our abundant supply of low-skilled, low-wage labour, we'll become the global factory, the factory for the world, making anything and everything that the world needs. And 30 years later, that's basically what happened. The model rests on low wage, manufacturing for export, and high levels of domestic investment supporting the infrastructure necessary for that to occur, and low levels of domestic consumption. That economic model is about to reach its use-by date. Chinese leadership is extraordinarily intelligent on these questions. They've been analysing it for the last half-decade. And their conclusion, produced in the last Chinese five-year plan, the 12th five-year plan in 2010, is along these lines. We must now, as China, transform our economic model along the following lines. We must turn ourselves into an economy not driven primarily in its growth from exports on global markets, because two things are happening. Our wage rates are going up and global markets increasingly look unstable and wobbly, with some new forces for protectionism. Secondly, therefore, the driving force for China's next phase of economic growth must increasingly be domestic consumption. And therefore, China will need a lower domestic savings rate, which is currently at phenomenally high levels, and a lower government capital investment rate, as well as the further reforms of the private economy to create bigger space for China's private sector, including, in my judgment, the likely privatisation of a number of Chinese state-owned enterprises, including, in my judgment, the reform of China's finance and credit systems to provide easier lines of capital for Chinese private firms in the marketplace who are at present discriminated against by an overwhelming state-owned sector. And thirdly, I believe through further reforms in the Chinese currency and its international market rates. The net impact of all the above is that the Chinese leadership has decided that in order to sustain growth for the future and the 22 to 25 million new jobs needed each year to sustain employment opportunities for those emerging out of the university systems and elsewhere, that this is what now needs to be done to keep growth at around the magic target of 7.5 to 8.5%. Because the current model increasingly is producing growth of 6.5 to 7.5%, and that has been causing fundamental concerns for leadership. The good news further is that as a result of all this, and accompanying this as well, the new Chinese leadership announced only a week or so ago at the 18th Congress of the Chinese Communist Party is led by a standing committee of the Politburo made up of 7 men, the bulk of whom are economic reformers, the vast bulk of whom are economic reformers. So therefore, not only do they intellectually or in policy terms get the script for the future, but what I see is a centre of political gravity in this new leadership led by Xi Jinping and Premier Li Keqiang, which will deliver the implementation of this on the ground as well. And remember, the reason is this: there isn't an alternative script available. The Chinese leadership has not magically and suddenly fell in love with Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations. They haven't had a midnight cathartic experience about liberal economic philosophers from the Western tradition. No, they've worked it out for themselves that this is necessary. A buoyant private sector to generate sufficient growth in employment activity to absorb future labour market needs. Of course, where all the rubber hits the road here is as follows. The Communist Party itself and its future legitimacy hangs now on 2 pillars. Communism, or Marxism, as an ideology, is effectively dead. If you brought in 30 years worth of market-based reforms, it's difficult to talk about what communism and Marxism mean today in China. So therefore, what's the basis of legitimacy of a communist party which is still a Leninist state? Well, there are 2 answers to that. One is continue to deliver the economic goods for the country so that people are lifted out of poverty, so that living standards rise increasingly into middle income status, and on top of that, that China regains its place as a respected member of the international community of nations, which is the second pillar of legitimacy, nationalism. China's view of its own self as being a pivotal power in the world, as once it was back in the days of the Ming dynasty, the Song dynasty, the Tang dynasty, and the Han dynasty. In Chinese self-perception, this is returning to where China once was. These, therefore, China assuming its own perception of its own national greatness and continuing to deliver the economic goods, is where modern China now stands. So you might say, what's in it for us? Well, from the perspective of Australian business, let me say this. When you look at the implementation of this new growth model, depending increasingly on high levels of domestic consumption, depending increasingly on urbanisation, and for the first time in China's history as of last year, more Chinese now live in cities than in the countryside. And thirdly, the expansion of a private sector driven services sector, which will be so much of the engine for economic growth. Trace the evolution of our own economy and the economy of economies of all Western countries. The evolution is basically from agricultural self-sustaining arrangements through to agricultural markets, through to light industry, to heavy industry, through the emergence of services sectors, and then services sectors ultimately generate the bulk of economic activity and growth. China is on that trajectory. So what are the services sectors which are about to explode into activity? The financial services sector is one, including within it the funds management industry, including within it the management of Chinese pension funds, including within it massive investment needs on the part of Chinese pension funds to invest in reliable assets and predictable assets around the world in order to generate stable growth given the instability of certain markets elsewhere and some uncertainties about China at home. It also means that if you're in the business of selling education services, as Griffith University is in, that if we're sensible about it as a nation, and because of the quality of our higher education institutions, we are just at the beginning point of what could be a complete revolution in the Australian economy driven by the sale of education services, primary, secondary and tertiary across the system. Already, the sale of education services looms as one of Australia's largest exports. With the China market, it can take off even further, assuming we maintain the quality of our own system. The third is this. If you're looking again at the services sector, those of you who are in the engineering, construction and design business should know this, that the construction phenomenon in China is not about to stop. It is now going down to China's second and third tier cities. There are some 100 cities, I'm advised, in China with populations prospectively in excess of 1 million each, a large number with populations in excess of 5 million each, and a smaller number again with populations in excess of 10, 15 million each, the megacities. The construction, design, environmental engineering, water engineering, etc. skills needed for that grand construction project is huge. I was in the Middle East last weekend and I just saw some of the work from Australian construction firms around Dubai and Abu Dhabi and the rest. Frankly, the China market is emerging on all these questions as well, big time. Across the spectrum, therefore, of the services industries, there is a huge demand for what we do in the future. This, therefore, spells opportunities for firms here in Queensland, firms here in Brisbane. And not just the big firms, middle firms, smaller firms as well. And one of the reasons why I believe the National Broadband Network is going to assist fundamentally in driving our B2B engagement, business-to-business engagement with Chinese and other markets is to link people with fast band speed and substantial bandwidth in order to link businesses with counterparts in China and other emerging markets so that these new opportunities can be taken further. The old days where it simply depended on only the Australian corporate majors being able to do business in these markets is, I believe, passing. The fact that you now have middle firms and smaller firms in Australia succeeding in China in multiple spheres, including the ones I've just mentioned, that in turn can be turbocharged once our bandwidth and band speed is frankly up to that you now find in most of China's major cities today. That's why I'm a passionate believer, for example, in the National Broadband Network. Now you may be interested as to how am I going to segue from that into the Queensland health system. I'm wondering that myself. But let me have a go. It's along these lines. One of the other critical areas of emerging demand in terms of China's export market is in the health services sector. The mathematics is pretty simple. When you see per capita income in China now rising above $5,000 to $6,000 US, and remember 30 years ago it was $500 to $600 US, when you see the emergence of a Chinese middle class now in the vicinity, depending on how you count it, of 50 to 100 million, and when you look ahead to where median incomes are likely to be come 2020 to 2030, China is rapidly becoming a middle-income country. A 1.3 billion person country becoming a middle-income country, with the full dimensions, as I said, for demands for goods and services of the type I've just described. The good folk of China are no different from the good burghers of Brisbane or the good denizens of Queensland. And that is, they want first-class healthcare. And therefore there is a whole new platform for Australia to work within in terms of the sale of healthcare services into the Chinese market. Let me give you a few facts and figures if I can quickly find the relevant section of my carefully prepared speech. And they are these. If you look at the growth figures in China alone, the number of private hospitals in China has now increased by 20% in the last year alone, to a total of 8,947 as of May 2012. We're seeing record highs in the amounts of investment in China's healthcare industry, tripling over the last 3 years to 4.1 billion in 2011 alone. The Chinese government this year revised its guidelines and is now actively encouraging foreign investment in the health sector. Deloitte estimate that China's growth in medical services market is currently growing at 18% per annum, more than twice the general growth rate in the rest of the Chinese economy. So you see, this provides opportunities as well. One of the dynamic services sectors alive in this economy, which provides us with a platform for export. But as with education, it hangs on a single premise, and that is that the quality of the institutions and the quality of the sector in this country remains world-class. We currently have 4 or 5 Australian universities under the various rating systems which exist in Australia, around the world. We're in the top 100. And in terms of the quality of our healthcare system, all elements included, from acute medicine to medical research down to community medicine, we are also ranked as one of the best healthcare systems in the world. Therefore, sustaining that reputation into the future is fundamental to our ability to turn this into a platform for export into the future as well. People might say, well, that sounds all very well, Mr. Rudd, but we have all these needs here on the home front. That is true. But look at the education sector. The fact that we have hundreds of thousands of foreign students in Australia today has not cost a single Australian student a tertiary place. It's provided a much needed revenue stream into the Australian tertiary sector to sustain our university expansion programs in the future. Now, the precise form which healthcare may represent as an export platform to China remains to be seen. But if I could nominate a couple of possible areas, one is institutions like Ramsay Health, who are already successful international builders, owners and operators of hospitals not just in developed countries but in developing countries as well, provides, I believe, a model for what we can do in parts of emerging China where high quality health services are required. Secondly, it may be in the commercial application of the phenomenal successes already alive in the Australian medical research industry. Sometimes here in Brizzy, we need to pinch ourselves about the sheer quality of what we have alive in this city at the Queensland Institute of Medical Research, at the Institute of Molecular Biology, and other places here in our Queensland tertiary institutions, including the Institute of Tropical Medicine Research up in far north Queensland. What is often lacking here is the private capital and venture capital around to actually turn research and innovation into commercially applicable products and services. Therefore, for our venture funds and venture capitalists to be able to team up with Chinese funds so that some of the benefits from this can still come back in terms of intellectual property for Australia and also in terms of long-term revenue earnings, while having the capital also to take this into much wider markets, and the depth of venture capital markets available to assist in that process, again represents opportunities for Australia. Also, discrete opportunities might also open up in terms of the private hospital industry in this country in the provision of various forms of surgical procedures for international customers and clients as well. This is not my field of expertise. I've always been on the wrong end of a surgeon's knife. In fact, I've been on the wrong end of a number of knives, when you think about it. Back to the subject. But the bottom line is this. Those of you who have some familiarity with this sector, together with the other services industries I referred to before, think long and hard about how those opportunities then open up for you and your businesses in the future as well. Therefore, there are great opportunities which lie ahead. In my remaining 5 minutes, let me make a couple of points about the absolute importance of therefore sustaining that which we have. As a Queenslander, and as someone who's had a fair bit to do with the healthcare system in this state over a long, long time, and then having served in the federal political arena as well, I'm quite passionate that we sustain and enhance that which we have, rather than see it dismembered block by block. I'm going to make a few sharp points here, because I believe there is a clear difference in our approach as the Australian government to what we've seen so far on the part of the Liberal National Party at the state level, but respectively also what the Liberal National Party may well do nationally. In the short period of time, we, the Australian government, have embarked upon a comprehensive program of national health and hospital reform and funding. This has been across the healthcare system: preventative healthcare, primary healthcare, acute healthcare, subacute healthcare, aged care, mental health, e-health, workforce training and development. And these have been the subject of a range of agreements between the Australian government and the state governments of this country over the last several years. There is one clear cornerstone in all of this, and that is a challenge we inherited when we assumed office in 2007. And it's as follows. Back in 2007, what we had was evidence of, year by year, the Commonwealth Government withdrawing in terms of its relative funding responsibility to the states for the funding of our public hospital system. This is not an invented statistic, it is a real statistic. When the Labor government left office in 1996, we at that stage were funding 46% of the public hospital bill of the country. When Mr Howard and Mr Costello left, that figure had fallen to less than 42% of the pie. And given that we are looking at a national hospitals and health budget into the hundreds of billions once you put the Commonwealth and the states together, that 4 to 5 percentage point slide meant billions and billions of dollars being transferred from Commonwealth to state responsibility, and as a result, a real funding crisis within the states themselves. Two consequences flow from that. Either state governments simply starve their systems of the necessary investment, or, on the other hand, you have a better and more sustainable healthcare agreement between the Commonwealth and the states for the future, with the Commonwealth paying its fair and sustainable share. What we've now committed to in a new Commonwealth State Health Agreement is for the funding proportionalities to be entrenched at 50-50. That figure will be reached by 2017, and we are already up to 44-45 in reaching that objective. It is absolutely fundamental for the future of the public hospital system, which is the backbone of the Australian medical system, for these institutions to remain world-class. And that cannot happen by just pulling ideas out of the air. It requires cold, hard cash, and the predictability of those cash flows into the future. And that, I believe, is what we have done. Of course, the alternative, again, for the states is, sure, if the burden was to still to fall to them, and the proportionality of Commonwealth funding was to slip below 42 to 41 to 40 to the mid-30s, which is the trajectory on which it was on, then the alternative for the states is, yes, we will fund health, but by the time you got to 2050, on the basis of the annual increase in state health outlays for the hospital system alone, state budgets would do nothing else other than fund health. There would be no extra money left. This is a fundamental piece, not just of federal reform, it's a fundamental piece of sustainable healthcare reform as well. So if you look at what we've done in terms of the qualitative reforms around the establishment of a national preventative healthcare agency, $1 billion investment in terms of preventative healthcare programs to deal with the long-term causes of type 2 diabetes, of smoking-related diseases, an emphasis on health and exercise and the rest, in order to deal with the huge bubble of chronic diseases which is coming down the railroad tracks towards us. These actions are necessary. Our investment in the primary healthcare sector, a new national network of Medicare locals, some 61 of them right across the country, to coordinate healthcare programs for local people. The establishment of more than 60 GP super clinics to provide alternatives to people rushing into accident and emergency, who operate flexible hours with a range of allied health services as well. The investment also, some $1 billion plus, into the upgrade and enhancement of emergency departments in hospitals, so that when people present, they don't automatically become bed blockers into the acute hospital beds within that hospital, which are needed often for patients who are in a much worse condition. Further investment in a number of subacute beds, and further our investments also in aged care, in mental health, as well as in the medical workforce. And most critically, in e-health and personally controlled electronic health records as well. This is what we have done over the last 5 years. It is hard work, and you will see evidence of it in virtually every hospital, every region, in every part of the country, whether the political seats are held by the Labor Party, the Liberal Party or the National Party, because it is a fundamental and necessary national reform for the future of our system. Therefore, the legitimate question I pose for the alternative Prime Minister of Australia, Mr Abbott, is this: will he commit to sustain the Commonwealth's 50% contribution to the future health and hospital needs of the country or not? Of all the investments we have made in Medicare locals, in GP super clinics, in the funding to emergency departments in public hospitals in Queensland, will he withdraw funding from any of those programs which are still on way? And if so, which and by how much? This is too important just for politics. It's about fundamental national health and hospitals reform, necessary to equip this state and this country for the future, to ensure the long-term fiscal survivability of the states, but to conclude my remarks on this point, but to sustain a world-class platform for health and hospitals in this country, so that we can also, from it, create a whole new export industry for Australia as well. I thank you for your time.